where we have covered that Oracle architecture is divided into two parts. One is the database instance and another one is database itself. Instance is further consists of two parts. One is SGA, that is System Global Area, which is basically all memory, and another is the background processes. And then we covered different kind of storage structure that are available in DBMS. So in Oracle database, our memory is divided into table spaces. Table spaces are divided into segments. Segments are divided into extents, and extents are further divided into blocks. So blocks are our basic unit in which the data is stored. So one block of Oracle may correspond to one block of memory in your operating system, or two or more blocks of memory in your operating system may correspond to one block of Oracle. So that depends upon system to system. So for Oracle, the smallest unit is block where you can store the data. When you contiguously allocate the memory, contiguously allocate the blocks, that contiguous allocation, one contiguous allocation is called extent. So we can have multiple contiguous allocations that are for a single table. For example, in this case, table A is shown with the color green and table B is shown with the color red. So here we can see different extents are there. So in the first block B1 table, so B node table, for table B, the very first extent is B node, which is a contiguous allocation. And then when second request arrives for the B table, then maybe some another chunk has been allocated. Then it is another, you can say, block in that particular case. So we can have different extents, and the different extent combined make a file, data file, which is also called segment, and multiple segments or multiple data file combined can be contained into a table space, and our memory, our total database is divided into different table spaces. So the purpose that we have already cleared in the last lecture, the purpose of creating that kind of logical separation is basically to control the access of the memory by the user. So whenever you create a user may access the full database. User may be able to access only table space, some particular table space. User may be able to access only some segment or some extent only, or some database block only. So we have a finer control over the access of the user, that over the permission or to the user to which he or she can access the database. So that part we have covered in last lecture. Uh, there is more detail about table space. There are some default table spaces that are already created when you installed Oracle. The available, the table space that are generated by the system are system, sysogs, users, undo table space, and temp table space. These are the table space that are created by default when you install the Oracle system. The system and sysogs, these are the table space that store the system generated objects such as data dictionary table. So every system, every Oracle system, when you install it, it requires the space to store the information that is specific to the system. For example, data dictionary, so it has to store that particular information at some area, and that area is called table space in Oracle. And there are two table space. These are name of table space are system and sysog. These are specifically for the root user. And you should not store any object in this table, because these table spaces are for storing the system generated objects. So whenever the system generates some object, those objects are stored into these two table spaces. So we should not use these table spaces for our own for storing our own data. Next is the user table space that is helpful for the ad hoc user. So whenever you create a user 1, user 2, up to you can create any number of user. So all the user by default, they are allocated the table space area of user. So this is the table space name that is allocated to all the users that you create by default. So it is for the all the users. Then there is undo table space which holds all the undo data, which should also not be used by the user. So user should avoid to use this particular table space because it contains the information about undo data which is required for recovering from the failure. So whenever your system fails, you need to recover it. Then you will use undo table space. System will use undo table space. The information that is stored into undo table space, that information will be used by the system. Uh, then there is another table space, that is temp, which is basically temporary table space, which is used for storing the intermediate result. For example, when I retrieve the data from the tables and I have to join the tables. So suppose I want to join the table 1 and table 2 and then table 3. So if I want to join these three tables, I have to join because operations are binary in nature. So I have to join T1 and T2, store their result, store their result temporarily at some location, and then I will join their particular result with the table T3. So that means I need some storage area that will hold the temporary results. So intermediate, these are called intermediate results. So temp is a table space that is being used for storing all such type of information, all such type of data that are generated during the execution of the query. Intermediate data. So these table space should not be used by the end user. For example, if you are using user 1 to up to user n, any number of end user, they should not use undo table space, they should not use temporary table space, they should not use system or sysogs table space. By default, they are allocated the users table space, but you can create your own table space that are specific for that particular user. So this is the default table space, but you can use it as well as you can create your own table space for the user that you have created and allocate that table space to the user, so that user 1 can work only in their own table space, user 2 can work only in their own table space, and so on. So you can create as much table space as you want. So uh, then coming to the instance structure. So as we have already discussed, the database is divided into two parts. One is database, another one is database instance. So database is further divided into memory area, because database is basically memory area. So it is further divided into four parts that we have already covered. That is extent, block, extent, segment, and table space. Now coming to instance, what is the internal structure of instance, what instance contains. We have already discussed that instance contains SGA plus some processes. So that we have already discussed that SGA is a part of instance plus some background processes are there. Background processes are there that are a part of instance. So when application connect to the Oracle database, they connect to a database instance. Basically, whenever an external application, for example, your PHP program or SQL Plus program, so whenever they try to connect with the database, Oracle database, they connect with the database instance directly, first of all. So database instance has the following processes. One of the processes client process, another one is background process, third one is server process. So I will show you again the diagram. Uh, uh, this is our overall diagram. So this is client process, this is server process, and these are the background process. So instance consists of instance is communicating with the client process. Client process sends the request to the server process, and server process is responsible for getting the data for the client. And apart from that, we have background processes that are also included in the instance. So client process are the processes that are created and maintained to run the software code of an application program or an Oracle tool. For example, SQL Plus is a Oracle tool. SQL Plus is an Oracle tool that is used for getting the data, that is used for sending the command to the Oracle server. Similarly, you can have your own program, own software code that can be used for accessing the data from the database. So all that become the part of the client process. Then we have background process. Background process asynchronously perform input, output, and monitor the Oracle database processes to provide increased parallelism for better performance and reliability. So all these are the helper program, basically background process that will execute in the back end, and they will help to improve the efficiency. They will help to increase the parallelism and better performance and as well as reliability. So this is the purpose of creating the background processes. So all these are the helper processes. Apart from these, we have a server process also. So these processes communicate with the client. So the purpose of server process is to communicate with the client process and interact with the Oracle database to fulfill the request. So whatever the request sent by the client, so you have so your server process is responsible for fulfilling that request. So whatever the request is, it may be for accessing the data, it may be for deleting the data, or it may be for updating the data. So whatever the request is, the server process is responsible for process is responsible for processing that request. For so it is a intermediator between the client and your database. So there are some key points that you must consider, you must be aware of about the instances. Four key points are there. The first one is that you cannot start a database instance without having it to accessing any database file. So this is how you create a database, starting an instance first and creating the database from within the instance. First of all, you have to create the database. You have to create an instance. For example, whenever you install the Oracle system, so by default one instance is created there. So that instance is your XC instance. Most of the case, if you are using 18 Express edition, if you are using 18 version 18 Express edition, then by default one instance is created, and at that time there is no database in the data in the Oracle system. So we have no database in the Oracle system. In order to create, first of all you have to create the database instance. So once you create a database instance, after that you can create a database within that instance. Then second point is that an instance can access only one database at a time. So at a time on my system there can be a multiple database. For example, I can host the database of company A, company 1, and as well as company 2, as well as company 3, up to we can host the database of n number of companies on a single machine. But on the single machine, I can have only one instance. If I have only one instance, then out of all these database, I can connect at a time only one database. So if the database of company C1 is connected with the instance, then at the same time for the company C2, I cannot connect this database with my instance. I can have more than one instance at the same time in my system. For example, one is the default instance XC. In the similar way, I can create the more instance. More instance can be created, and but one instance can be accessed only one database at a time. The third point is that multiple database instance can access the same database. Again, if we have multiple instances that are executing on the same machine, so on my one machine, I have instance 1 as well as instance 2. Then both the instance can access. So if I have two instances, instance 1 and instance 2, then both the instances can access the same database. That means they both can access the database of company C1, or they both can access the database of company C2, and so on. So multiple database instances can access the same database, but an instance can access only one database at a time. So finally, the last key point, that is a database can exist without an instance. We can create the database without an instance, but it would be unusable because it is just a set of files. So without instance, you cannot access the database. Database can exist independent, instance can exist independent, but to access the database, we must have at least one instance that is connected with the database. Otherwise, if the database can exist without any instance, it would be unusable because it is just a set of files. So what is database? A database is just a set of files. So in case of Oracle, we are talking about in case of Oracle. Then coming to listener, again very important aspect, very important factor in Oracle database system. So listener is basically a separate database server process. It is a process. It is a process that is that runs on the server. So listener is a separate database server process that runs locally on the database server. It will be executing on the same machine where your database server is executing, or it may run remotely on the Oracle environment also. So if we are installing Oracle on our own laptop, then there will be a separate listener program. And if we are installing the Oracle on a server on a different system, then the listener will be executing on that system itself. So the purpose of listener is to communicate, to enable the client to connect with your server. So it is very important. Without a listener, you cannot connect with your servers, you cannot connect with the Oracle. So when a client request comes, listener first receive it as shown in this particular diagram. So whenever the request from the client, that request arrives, the very first task is that that request is coming to the listener. So listener will receive that request at the very first step, and then it establishes a connection between a client and the database instance. And it is the responsibility of this listener to create a connection between client and database server process. So once that connection is created, once the client is connected to the database instance successfully, the listener, it stands for listener, the listener hands over the client connection to the server process. So if the listener stops running, you cannot connect to your database anymore. So in order to connect with your database, a listener program must be executing on your system. So that's what we are trying to do yesterday also. And again, we will discuss after this lecture about the listener. So to listener is a small program which will be installed on your system when you install the Oracle. It will be automatically installed, and nothing to do with you need nothing to do for the listener, because it is basically a background process that will be executing automatically whenever you install the system. Whenever you install the Oracle, listener is also installed automatically, and when you start the system, Oracle database is started automatically, as well as listener is also started automatically. But somehow, if there is some issue, some problem, you can start the listener from the command prompt also. But for that, you have to open the command prompt in the administrative mode. So for that, just right click on the command prompt icon and select the option run as administrator. So if you select that option, then your command prompt will be executing in the administrative mode. Then in that command prompt, you have to type the command lsnrctl, listener control. So this is listener control, listener lsnrctl space, it's a space pani, you have to put the space here, then status. So it will show you the status of the listener, whether it is executing, whether it is running or not running. So you can check the status of the listener. By default, it will be running if it is installed. Then if it is running, you can stop it. You can omit this particular arrow, and you can put the space here, listener control space stop. So by executing this command, your listener will stop, and any attempt to connect to the Oracle database after executing this command will result in the following error, that TNS no listener is there. So it is the error that you will see if the listener is not working. So if you see this kind of error, then you have to execute this command, listener control start. So if this command executes successfully, you will see the OK message. Then your listener is in the running state, and then you can connect with your database. So this is important in order to execute the queries in order to work with the database, Oracle database. You have to you have to check whether the listener is in running state or not. So